Welcome to the reading room of the Royal United Services Institute at Hyde Park in Sydney. It's part of the Anzac Memorial. We're here with the Korean Cultural Centre in Sydney to remember 70 years since the outbreak of the Korean War. The war began on the 25th of June 1950 when the People's Army of North Korea rolled across the 38th parallel and began an invasion of the South. The war had been years in its build-up because the Korean Peninsula was caught in a power vacuum at the end of the Second World War. Having been colonised by the Japanese in the early 20th century, the peninsula had been used by that empire, but of course with the collapse of Japan in 1945, the old allies, the East and West, the communists backed by the Soviet Union and the West largely funded by the United States, decided to divide most of those former enemy territories, and the occupied Korean Peninsula fell into that category. The communists took over the north, and the attempt to create a republic in the south, largely backed by the United States. Of course, there was always going to be tension between those power blocks, and those tensions kept building. The United Nations stepped in and sent a team of advisors to the 38th parallel. What that advisory team discovered was that the North Koreans were clearly much more aggressive than the Army of the Republic of South Korea, and their report, submitted just days before the invasion, clearly indicated that if there was going to be any act of aggression, it was going to come from the north. That report, authored by two Australians, Stuart Peach and Ron Rankin, an Army officer and an Air Force officer, was used by the United Nations immediately after the invasion to justify the United Nations involvement in the war. But how did Australia get involved? Well, we were a member of the United Nations and very keen to support the United States in its war against communist aggression wherever that occurred. Because Australia's fighting forces were still in occupation in Japan, and so we were ideally located to be able to provide Army, Naval and Air units in support of United Nations operations on the Korean Peninsula. The North Korean invasion was initially massive and well organised, and the ill-prepared Army of the Republic, as well as a handful of US troops still on the peninsula, were quickly driven back. Seoul was captured, and the United Nations, the US and Republican forces fell back around the port city of Busan, modern Busan, and they formed what the Americans called the Busan Perimeter, largely on the Nakdong River. They held out against all odds until more and more United Nations forces, largely US backed, could arrive and resupply and support the Busan Perimeter. But fighting their way across the Nakdong River was not going to be easy, and immediate relief of the siege was essential. The American general on the scene was MacArthur, famous for his amphibious landings during the Second World War. MacArthur came up with a dreadfully risky idea of landing a marine force at Incheon, halfway up the peninsula, and cutting the line of supply. Against the odds, the landing paid off, and immediately, with a breakout from the Busan Perimeter and the thrust inland from Incheon, the North Koreans were forced to retreat. What that meant was that the opening year and a half of the war was one of dramatic movement. The invasion from the north that crossed the 38th parallel and drove the UN forces back to the southern tip of the peninsula was countered by this seaborne invasion and a push from the south. The Australians became immediately involved and joined the push out of Busan by October of 1950. Of course, the Royal Australian Air Force had sent a fighter squadron based in Japan in support of US air units that were bombing North Korean lines of supply. Against that level of technology, the North Korean army could do nothing but retreat. And so they quickly fell back, and the Americans crossed the 38th parallel and drove the North Koreans all the way back to the Yalu River, within sight of the Chinese frontier. The Chinese saw an immediate threat on their frontier and so decided to cross and come into the war in support of North Korea. And so a counter-offensive from the communist side began through the winter blizzards of October 1950. Again, the Americans and the Korean army were driven south, with the Chinese leading the way. They crossed the 38th parallel. Again, Seoul was captured and the UN were driven well back to the southern section of the peninsula. During that fighting retreat, the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment got to defend a junction of the Kapyong River, and the battalion still wears the US Distinguished Unit citation for their gallantry in holding up that retreat in the days before Anzac Day 1951. Eventually, United Nations forces were able to cause the Chinese offensive to grind to a halt, and then they countered with massive technology. They began the advance, and on the Imjin River, again the 3rd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, distinguished itself in the capture of Hill 317 or Mariangsan in October. Shortly after the October battles, the war settled down to one of stalemate. That stalemate occurred almost on the lines where the war had begun. The 38th parallel again became the dividing line between North and South. Meanwhile, both sides were locked in peace negotiations around the village at Panmunjom. But it seemed that no headway could be made. Those peace talks dragged on year after year, while soldiers on the ground, airmen in the air, and sailors at sea were dying. Fighting and dying on that peninsula. For most Australians, they remember the cold, the brutal cold of the Korean winters. The war became a savage stalemate of night patrols with teams from both sides hunting each other in the valleys from the Samachon River to both oceans. Finally, by July of 1953, there was a breakthrough in the peace negotiations and an armistice was arranged. At last the fighting would come to an end. But on the very last day of the war, the Chinese launched a final offensive on the Imjin. They attacked across the Samachon Valley and attacked a position called the Nevada Line. On the right flank of the Nevada Line were the Australian 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment. The last Australian killed in action in that war died within hours of the armistice coming into effect at dawn on the 27th of July 1953. Despite the armistice, no peace treaty has ever been settled, making the Korean War the longest in modern history. On the 27th of July 1953, an armistice finally came into effect, again dividing Korea in half along the 38th parallel. What was created by that armistice was a demilitarised zone some 4 kilometres wide, and the United Nations have provided a garrison for several years after the war. Today, the Army of the Republic of Korea still mans the DMZ. Australia continues to participate in the maintenance of the demilitarised zone as members of the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission, and they have several members of the embassy team continue to supervise breaches of the ceasefire. The war goes on, but for Australian veterans, they remember that period of 1950 to 1953, and they visit frequently the graves of fallen Australians who lie in Korean soil, beautifully tended by the gardeners at the United Nations Memorial Cemetery at Busan, lest we forget. Now we'll speak to a very prominent survivor of Australia's contingents to the war in Korea. Rear Admiral Ian Crawford retired. Ian was a teenager when he deployed to the Korean War in 1950 on board a British warship, HMS Ceylon. He retired from the Royal Australian Navy in 1989 and in 2002 was made an Officer of the Order of Australia for his services to veterans of the Korean War. I'd like to welcome Admiral Ian Crawford. So if we go back to 1950,
Yes.
you're a teenager
Yes.
in the Royal Australian Navy on exchange with the Royal Navy, serving on board a British cruiser, HMS Ceylon. How did you hear about the outbreak of the Korean War?
Well, we had heard that there were tensions on the Korean Peninsula. We were East Indies fleet based in Trincomalee, preparing for a program which was focused on East Africa, Persian Gulf and India. And then we heard that the Korean War broke out. Fine, that was it. We still had our program. Indeed, our medical officer had signed 600 certificates for 600 alcoholics because we were going to India. And that was the only way you could get a drink in India in those days. But we thought we were committed to being the flagship of the East Indies fleet. Then we heard, and our captain cleared lower deck. We all fell in on the quarterdeck, and he told us that HMS Belfast had finished the end of its commission in the Far East Fleet, had to go back to England, pay off and recommission, and the Brits, with all the tensions in the Far East, did not want to leave the Far East one cruiser short. So we were very rapidly transferred to the Far East Fleet from the East Indies Fleet.
Were there many other Australians on HMS Ceylon at the time?
No, I was the only one, which is always a bit difficult, especially as the cricket tests were on at the time. So.
Of course. So you were deploying to the war within days almost of the outbreak. You're getting orders to go to where the conflict is occurring, and you're arriving certainly within months of the invasion. What were you expecting to find?
Well, we expected the war to be over very quickly. Amongst the young, there was the feeling, I hope it doesn't end too quickly, because for the young it was an adventure. For the older ones, and especially the married ones, and being for 2 years on the station with the ship, the families were coming out. And the families arrived, many of the families arrived in Trincomalee in troop ships on the day we left for Singapore to refit, to train and take off. So it was a great disruption to the program and to the well-being of the people on board.
What sort of a briefing were you given about the threat that you were going to be facing, or the sort of campaign service that Ceylon was going to be involved in?
We had to reinforce what was most important was our damage control, and therefore in the event that we were hit, and there was an old Japanese destroyer in Singapore which was patched up, and we used to do damage control exercises. We had to go through there. They have fires, and we had to learn how to put out the fires, how to repair the ship. So the whole ship's company went through that routine, and we had to refit the ship. There were certain things that had to be fixed up in the ship. We were still very much in a peacetime condition. Therefore, we had to transform to a war preparedness.
So what was your task on the vessel?
I was there under training. I was a supply specialist, therefore I was to learn my supply duties. But because there was a shortage of people, I was very quickly transferred to other activities. And my action station was transferred. I became the assistant gun direction officer for the close range weapons. That's for the starboard side of the ship, which was behind the bridge. I had to be a watchkeeper in the air direction room. So apart from trying to learn my other duties, I became very much involved in the war fighting capability of the ship.
What sort of threats were you expecting? Were you expecting attack from the air? Were you expecting attack from motor torpedo boats? Was there a consciousness that the North Koreans had received hundreds of sea mines from the Soviet Union just prior to the outbreak of the war?
This materialised as we went along.
Right.
In the first place, the surface fleet of the United Nations, which was the US 7th Fleet, and the British Far East Fleet, before we got there, had disposed pretty much of the North Korean surface fleet. So that was not a threat. There was a threat which materialised soon after the landing at Incheon of air attack on the ships. And that was always a risk. There was the risk of counter-bombardment, because many of our duties were bombarding positions along the North Korean and the South Korean front, and they would return our fire, and they had very limited range, but at times they did constitute a threat. And then, of course, there was the threat of mines. Now, by international convention, mines are supposed to be tethered, but the North Koreans and the Chinese hadn't come into the war at this stage, used to release mines, floating mines, from junks, or release them into rivers so that they would come down the rivers and constitute a threat. Some ships had been damaged, and we were always aware of this. We used to stream paravanes, which are advised for diverting a tethered mine from the side of the ship so that it could be cut and surfaced and destroyed by a rifle fire. But of course, if they weren't tethered, that was another risk. So we had to be very careful, and we were conscious of that at all times. And there was also a rumour, and it was probably a pretty soundly based rumour, that there was a Russian submarine. We didn't know which way Russia was going to go at that stage. If there was a Russian submarine, it was probably more likely just observing what was going on, because I think Stalin was very anxious not to escalate the war.
Mm. Specific actions. You were involved in the landings at Incheon.
Yes, we were escorting the British carrier, HMS Triumph, and we were standby in case any of the bombardment ships were hit. So as well as escorting the carrier, which was taking missions ashore, and our task element, which was Warramunga and Bataan. And as the only Australian, as a young Australian midshipman, I was very proud of those two Australian ships. But we escorted Triumph for most of the time until we had to go off and do other bombardment duties.
What did you see of the landings? Were you standing off protecting the carrier, or did Ceylon get in close enough to watch the Americans, the 10th Corps, land?
No, we didn't see that. We saw the landing craft the day before, and we were off Incheon, but we didn't see the land. We didn't get into Incheon until many months later, when the Chinese had come into the war. So our participation in the landing at Incheon was very much escorting the carrier, and the day before seeing the armada of landing craft going into the shore.
If I asked you about your immediate memory when somebody says the Korean War, what comes straight to mind? What comes immediately to mind when asked about the Korean War?
Well, of course, there's always the cold, and that was tremendous. But it all came together: the cold and the threat when the Chinese came into the war. After the landing at Incheon, there was the feeling the war is over, where we hovered on the 38th parallel, and that's another story that has to come out. Whether we were cleared to go further north. And MacArthur had his ideas on what he wanted to do, but we hovered for a while, and then the general feeling was, okay, the war is over. We breached the 38th parallel, went further north, and then the Chinese came in. The Chinese came in at the onset of winter, and the tremendous or horrendous experiences ashore, and the loneliness that we felt. Because the feeling was that the war is over, the British fleet withdrew and went to Hong Kong for Christmas. And we were an East Indies ship. Our families were scattered all around the Far East and the East Indies. So it was said, okay, Ceylon will stay there. The Australian destroyers, of course, were there, and some Canadian destroyers. So we got the warning that the Chinese had come into the war. They had noted, our captain kept us well informed, that they had noticed different uniforms and people amongst the casualties on the other side. And suddenly we realized that there was a huge onslaught from the Chinese. And so at very short notice, and we were supposed to be refitting at Kure, having a rest period. We were very quickly got our ship back together again, took off for Sasebo, which was the base for the United Nations fleet, and we were asked by the American Admiral to go up and take charge of what was happening off the Taidong River, which was the port of Chinampo, which was a port for Pyongyang. And the 8th Army, the US 8th Army, was in retreat under horrendous conditions, and they retreated towards Chinampo and to Hungnam on the east coast. And our purpose was to supervise the evacuation and to go up to Chinampo and evacuate 8th Army people. So we were off Chinampo, no lights ashore, dark. We were the only one there, apart from the destroyers. Our captain was in command of the operation. The rest of the British fleet was in Hong Kong, being reassembled to come up and meet the new threat. And there was a feeling of loneliness against this onslaught, this dreadful creature coming down the coast of North Korea. And morale was pretty rock bottom. We'd been at sea for a long time. Our mail hadn't caught up with us. And it was a pretty desperate time. Morale was improved by the news that we'd got from families when the mail did catch up with us. We had been seen on television, and then they announced we were going to get a medal. Well, for those of us who weren't in the Second World War, that was very important. We had recognition. The importance of recognition for morale while you're serving and for the peace of mind of people in their older age. So it was a pretty desperate time. Of course, the winter set in. We had Arctic mist. The sea temperature was higher than the air temperature. And we had heavy seas. The seas would come over the bow, hit the superstructure, and turn into ice. So it was a pretty desperate time.
So after nearly 7 decades, how do you convey that story to the next generation? How would you like a 21st century generation to remember Australia's veterans of the Korean War?
I'd like to think of them of the commitment that Australia made. Australia is a good world citizen, and we readily answered the call. We made an independent. Normally when we went to war, First World War, Second World War, had been in response to a war that involved the UK. We were at pains to make sure that we were seen as making an independent decision, and that was important for politically, and that we were ready to go. We had the fighting ability. we didn't have the structure. The Army only had wartime forces, the AIF, First World War, Second World War. They had downgraded from that to peacetime. So we didn't have the readiness in the Army that we should have had. Navies are always ready to go, and the Air Force was there. So the important message for future generations is always show that we're ready to go. And the Korean War proved that with the fighting ability, especially the Army, I would say that, the endurance, the leadership, and the military skills of our people were demonstrated, and a source of great pride to all Australians. But then there's the aftermath of the Korean War, and the importance of commemoration. Memorials, that's important. I was involved with the Australian National Korean War Memorial, and that is important as a visual recognition. And then we have to consider the families of those who lost loved ones, especially the missing in action, and that's still an agony for them. And there's still 43 unknown Australians. We don't know whether they've been recovered, but that's an ongoing task. But then we are developing the Korean War Memorial in Canberra, so that there are horticultural features which you would find in the United Nations Memorial Cemetery, Korea in Busan, where 280 of our Australians are buried. Initially, we were not allowed to have foreign or overseas horticultural features, but that was relaxed. And now our aim is that the families, once again thinking of the families, can have some idea of the beauty that the Korean people have dedicated to the memory of the United Nations forces through the horticultural features at the tombstones and the trees that surround the cemetery. And we are trying to have a miniature version of that at the Korean War Memorial, so that families who never get to Korea will experience the love and attention given by the Korean people to the Australians and the United Nations. And then there's the geopolitical, strategic, economic outcome of the Korean War. And that was highlighted to me when I was starting the Korean War Memorial. We were anxious to get funds, and I turned to Geoffrey Blaney, historian, and said, would you mind giving some support because of the economic influences of the Korean War on Australia's future? And he turned to me and said, what, you think a pound for wool was good for the Australian economy? And suddenly I realised that there was more to it than just the wool. There was also the thought that it might become the Third World War. So there was a demand for wool and the strategic materials that we had in Australia. And then there were the alliances that we formed with the Americans, the Radford-Collins Agreement, ANZUS. These grew out in appreciation of the threat that was constituted in East Asia. And of course, the relations we have with our friends, the Koreans, confident in their ability to recognize what the Australians did through their various programs, the reunions that they provide, the recognition of the medals that they have given to us. We need somebody, a very clever historian, to go beyond what Bob O'Neill wrote in his history, even beyond what Michael Pembroke wrote in his, to look at the whole outcome, the way the world, but our part of the world, East Asia in particular, have changed since the Korean War.
In recent decades, there have been a number of pilgrimages by Australian veterans back to Korea. You've participated in several. What impressions have you gained, and what comparisons, I suppose, is more to the point, from your experiences in Korea during the war and your experience as a returning veteran?
Well, of course, as a sailor, we didn't see too much of what was going on ashore. I got ashore twice in Busan when we first arrived there, and it was a desperate situation because the perimeter had closed in on Busan, and it was a very run-down port facility. The only other place I went ashore to was Taechongdo, an island off Incheon. It was pretty basic the way they lived, and they were preparing for winter. Their houses were pretty flimsy, and we had experience of because our ship's company found an orphanage while we were in Incheon later on, and we were aware of the terrible conditions. And going back now, as I have on a few occasions in Australian missions, to see the dynamics of Korea, the way it has developed into a powerhouse economically, industrially, and even the rural economy has modernized. And it has also changed from being a very authoritarian society. It has made a tremendous, very exciting transition. And the other thing is that the friendliness of the people there. Whenever we go there and say, we're Australians, or I was there in the Korean War, thank you for what you did in the Korean War. And even when I see Korean friends in Sydney, who I haven't, or people I haven't met before, I tell them I was in the Korean War. Australians would say, what was the Korean War? The Koreans say, thank you for what you did. So it's a dynamic, progressive, exciting society, and an appreciative society. And they share a lot of our ways of doing things. Now, I won't say it's been westernized, that is wrong. It has been modernized. The Koreans are insistent on preserving their culture, and I admire them for that. It's a very praiseworthy culture, but they have modernized, and that's the difference between westernization and modernization. And they've done that.
Retired Rear Admiral Ian Crawford, thank you very much indeed for this.
Thanks,
your insights, much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you.